So you need to deal with those quickly, just to minimize the damage to your seed crop, minimize loss of yields and so forth. You know, a common thing we use are safer soaps and things like that to deal with that type of thing. But whatever you would use at your farm normally, try and deal with pest outbreaks quickly. Okay, I'm not seeing the entire thing here, but this is about knowing the scientific names of crops. And the scientific name is, if many of you will already know this, but the genus and species are how we refer to the scientific names. And you'll often see that in seed catalogs or seed saving guides. And it's critical information because essentially if two plants have they share the same genus and species name, then they will interbreed, they will cross, and they will, if you have both of them growing and going to seed in the same field, they will potentially cross-contaminate each other. So some examples of common crops that are different crops but share the same genus and species names. The Brassica oleracea scientific name applies to, let's see, Brussels sprouts, cabbages, cauliflower, broccoli, some of the kales. So even though they're very different crops, you are limited in being able to grow them in the same field and produce seed because they share the same scientific name, Brassica oleracea. And you gotta keep that in mind for all of the crops you're knowing. So you gotta get to know your scientific names. Another thing to watch out for is some of the weeds in your field. Some of the wild weeds are actually close relatives of our domesticated crops, and they can actually interbreed with those domesticated crops. Daucus carota, which is our regular carrot, domesticated carrot variety, that's also the scientific name of Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. So you gotta keep track of what your weeds are in your field and get to know their scientific names as well. There's a few other common weeds like purslane and wild chicory, and both those things will cross with their cultivated counterparts as well. So plant spacing, really important because as seed crops grow, they get so much bigger than what they often are in their vegetative stage. This little picture here illustrates it well. This is a broadleaf cress. So the cresses are just one example, but many plants do this. A cress, if you've ever grown it, it makes a rosette that's maybe 6 inches, 8 inches in diameter at the most. Small leaves that you use in your salad. But if you grow that out to seed, sorry, somebody seems to be jumping in, but what I'm saying is that. Oh,
okay, sorry, Patrick.
Yeah.
If somebody's just joined the call, can you please mute your speaker? Because we're getting a lot of feedback on the line.
So a lot of these seed crops will grow to many times their normal height in the vegetative stage. Something like this cress gets 2 to 3 feet high, and it might only be, at the most 10 inches high in the field otherwise, and it'll get almost 2 feet in diameter. So you have to plan that out when you're growing a seed crop. You space your plants further apart so that they're not too close together. So the problem is when they actually grow up and then they're finally drying down and trying to mature their seed, they need to have airflow and they need to have sunlight to get at all of those seeds and the pods to dry them down properly and to not, to allow things like rainfall to dry up quickly and to avoid fungal diseases. So crops fall into, other than perennials, most seed crops fall into the two categories of being an annual or a biennial. And it does affect how you'll grow them and the planning of them. On the left here is an annual called tatsoi. And just like many of the annuals, you want to start a lot of your annual plants quite early in the spring, as early as possible, because in reality, they're going to go through a much longer life cycle to then produce their seeds and dry down the pods. And what you want is for those seeds and pods to be drying down, ideally in August at the latest in early September, in order for you to have the best chance of reaching mature seed without running into rain problems or running into frost or cold rains at the end of the season. So start all of your annuals as early as you can, getting them in the ground as early as you can. Of course, you have to be aware of early frosts and stuff. And you say an example of this tatsoi and many of the other Brassica greens, you really want them to size up to their full size. It's not the same as growing a sort of cut and come again market salad, tatsoi or Mizuno or mustards. You're not trying to produce seed out of a small plant. You want the plant to grow to its full frame, to the plant architecture to be as big as possible, because by then it'll have developed a strong root mass that can go and forage for nutrients, and the leaves themselves will be photosynthesizing and providing energy to the plant. And it's that kind of energy and nutrient uptake that's going to drive the growth of the flowers and then the seed pods later on, and give you the highest yield of seeds from the plants, as well as giving you the best quality seeds, because they're going to be the biggest possible seeds. And those seeds then contain more carbohydrate, more energy reserves to then drive their germination and subsequent growth in the field in the following year. So start your annuals as early as you can and get those plants growing to their biggest size. A lot of these Brassica greens, for example, need to start early in order to grow big during the cool spring weather, right? They don't want to, once they get into hot weather, they bolt early. So you don't want to leave it too late. On the right-hand side here, you see a picture of a field of carrots in full bloom in their second year. But what I wanted to say is that with a lot of the biennials, which are many of them are root crops, you might not start them as early as you would normally for market production. And the reason for that is that when you finally pull those first year roots out of the ground to do your selection and your overwintering storage, you want to be able to look at those roots at a time in their life when they've kind of reached their ideal size and ideal shape for doing selection from. So if you started a carrot in early April and left it in the ground until September or October to harvest, it's going to be monster. Same with a lot of beets or other root crops. And it's going to be beyond the size at which you can really tell is it showing its ideal shape and so forth. So it's more like you decide, okay, I'm going to harvest those carrots in late September or sometime in mid-October or whenever you're going to do it. You count back from your sort of days to maturity, and you'll probably be planting carrots, for example, more like in the 3rd or 4th week of June, maybe even as late as early July, in order that when you harvest them, you can really see their ideal shape. So keep that in mind for biennials. On to the next slide. I wanted to talk about the difference between self-pollinating and cross-pollinating plants. Self-pollinating plants we often just refer to easily as selfers. The self-pollinating plants are probably the easiest ones to save seed from and to do it successfully. So I often recommend to beginning seed savers, start with the self-pollinating plants. You'll be more successful. You'll have an easier time of being successful. Once you save seed from those successfully, you can build on that experience and that knowledge base and start working with some of the cross-pollinating plants, which require, have a little bit more of a degree of difficulty. One of the reasons selfers are easier to grow is that smaller populations are needed or are required, so you can grow a smaller amount of them and still produce great quality seed. And then also, you don't need as big of an isolation distance between that and another crop that has the same genus and species. And the reason for that is, obviously, when we say they're self-pollinating, what we mean is that they don't tend to outcross, they don't tend to share pollen with other plants. In fact, they're self-pollinating because they have what's called perfect flowers with both the male and female parts within the same flower, and they often pollinate themselves before those flowers even open up. That's why there's very little chance of crossing with self-pollinators. The 4 easiest plants to save seed from and do it successfully, in my opinion, are lettuce, tomatoes, peas, and beans. So I always recommend those 4 crops as great ones to start with if you're just getting started. This picture here is my wife and I and our child beside one of the self-pollinating crops. Those are peas, and this is the way that we hang them to dry in the field. We kind of let them get to almost dried down stage, but because there's a little bit of variation in how they're drying down, we then go through and pull the entire plant up and bundle a whole bunch of plants together and hang them from the same trellising they were originally growing on and let them sit there for a few more weeks. In that case, in that instance, they all end up drying down evenly, and we're able to go through and then do the threshing and winnowing of the seeds all at once. Cross-pollinating plants, they are ones that actually require or need to share pollen from one plant to another or one flower to another on the same plant. they cannot pollinate themselves, either because they have what are called imperfect flowers, where the male and female parts are on different flowers, and therefore pollen needs to move from one flower to another. Or in some cross-pollinating plants, they do still have perfect flowers, but they also have a sort of a self incompatibility built into them, where they actually required the pollen to move from one flower to another genetically. And the reason that they've done this is that all those cross-pollinating plants, in order to maintain better genetic health, they need to share pollen with as many plants as possible. I've pictured here a few examples of cross-pollinating plants. There's leeks in the top left-hand corner, arugula in the bottom right-hand corner, and mustard greens in the bottom left corner there. Those are all examples of cross-pollinating plants. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a little chart that gives you more information about which plants are cross-pollinating and which ones are self-pollinating. All of this is, there's never any black and whites when it comes to seed saving and the way that nature works. So I've included this slide that was put together by Organic Seed Alliance and the Bauta Foundation, because it really illustrates that, in fact, whether you're a self-pollinating plant or a cross-pollinating plant, and by this I mean to say that also they're called inbreeders or outbreeders, there's no such thing as being strictly one or strictly the other. They often fall in a bit of a spectrum. And for example, if you look here at peppers, they're listed usually as a self-pollinating plant. But the thing to know is that they often will outcross as well. And so they fall not at one end or the other of the spectrum, but somewhere closer to the middle. And so your isolation distance that you need is certainly more than if they were peas or lettuce or tomato or something like that. So this is a handy little thing. And anybody who's watching this will later be able to refer back to all of these slides on the Bauta website. It'll be uploaded at some point in the near future. Isolation distance is really key when you're growing seeds, because if you want that seed to come true to type and not have crossed with something else, you need to follow recommended isolation distances. What are those recommended isolation distances? They're available in guides, books on seed saving all over the place, and I've got a chart at the end of this presentation that I'm going to show you as well. In order to know whether you need to follow an isolation distance, whether you're actually going to cross with something else, you got to know what you're growing in your field and know its scientific name. If it will cross with something else growing in the field, whether it's a domesticated plant or a wild, that's when you need to use isolation distances. And you can isolate in three ways: with distance, with physical barriers, or with time. Now, what I'll say about isolating with time is that in my experience, that's not so much of a possibility here in Canada, because we have a very short growing season, a fairly short window in which to grow those plants out to seed. Isolating in time is something that maybe they can do further down south in the US, but unless somebody else has got some information about this and wants to share it later in the or some experience with doing this, I would say isolating with time is not really possible for Canadian growers. But isolating with distance and barriers certainly is, and I'm going to show you some examples of that right here. Here's just another picture of our field, show you a little bit of how we lay out some of our seed crops, and showing you some of the isolation with distance we use. So one example, I'll use my pointer here to show a crop. This is a pea seed crop that I'm showing you here. And so that's growing peas for seed. Peas are self-pollinating and will rarely cross with anything else, but they can occasionally. And the recommended isolation distance for most peas is 50 feet. So I have got maybe 5 or 6 other pea crops in our fields, but you're not seeing them anywhere close to this one, because I want to make sure that that seed comes true to type. So I observe the 50-foot isolation distance. Another pea seed crop in the far distance over here. I've got another one growing there. And though you can't see them because they're further back in the field, I would have had a number of other seed crops further down in our field here, maybe even over to the left-hand side. But I'm maintaining a good isolation distance from any other seed crops. And I do that with any type of self-pollinating or cross-pollinating plants. We follow recommended isolation distances, and that's called isolating with distance. You can use physical barriers. To some extent, some people might consider, a big hedgerow full of trees that's really thick between fields to be the kind of physical barrier that can stop or usually at least slow down or stop the movement of pollinators. And that might be true, but it's still somewhat porous. It's not totally impervious, right? So if you've got a couple of different fields on your farm and they're separated by barriers like trees and stuff like that, or shrubs and hedges, you might consider that to be enough. But the only way you're really going to know is to grow that seed out the following year and have a good look at it and see if you've got crossing between that and something else. Another more foolproof way to create physical barriers is to use isolation cages, which are any kind of structure where you use some kind of impervious membrane to stop pollinators moving back and forth. In this case, at our farm, we're growing carrot seeds inside of a plastic sheathed high tunnel or polytunnel. And we actually introduce pollinators. In this case, we introduced flies to this. And if you're interested in more details on this, a group of us in BC did some experimenting with this summer and really learned well how to do it and have some great recommendations. And we've actually put together sort of a 40-page booklet on it that's just in its final editing, but will be available shortly within a few weeks. Sorry, I skipped there fast. It will be available very shortly at the bcseeds.org website. So you can look for that under the publications or resources tab of bcseeds.org. It'll probably be up there by the end of March, if not sooner. Population numbers, again, really important for maintaining, sorry, my cursor is jumping around a bit. Population numbers are really important for maintaining great seed quality and good lines. Again, selfers are easier because you can use smaller populations and you still get great quality seed. The reason for that is that in self-pollinating plants, over hundreds of years or over millennia of adaptation, they have evolved to be resistant to inbreeding depression. And so they don't suffer from any kind of deleterious effects, even though you might have only saved seed from a population of 10 or 20 or 5 or a smaller population number of plants. Outcrossers are very different. They require larger populations to avoid that inbreeding depression. What is inbreeding depression? Why do you want to avoid it? Well, inbreeding depression manifests itself in kind of undesirable traits like smaller stature, slower growth, more prevalence of off types or strange shapes happening, lower fecundity, which is lower ability to produce pollen and seed, and generally just lower yields. So inbreeding depression can have if you let it get out of hand by saving cross-pollinating seeds from small populations year after year, inbreeding depression can have a very negative effect on the quality of your seed. Some people that I talk to who are smaller scale growers say they focus on the self-pollinating plants, and I think that's great. But I do want to say that you can still grow outcrossers and grow larger numbers of them in a fairly small area of land. So an example here is us growing, we're not big growers. We only have between 2 and 3 acres of entire production in for seeds and for market growing. And over the years, I've grown all kinds of outcrossers in numbers that are more than adequate to maintain great genetic health. But I do it on a fairly small scale still. So here's an example of our carrot seed production. We grow, you can grow thousands of carrot roots in a fairly small piece of land, maybe 2 or 3 beds that are a few hundred feet long. And that gives you far more than enough carrots to go through and do your selection. And then grow them out in the second year. And in the second year, I might be down to only planting out, who knows, maybe 500 of those plants or something like that. Like these 2 beds of carrots, this is 2 beds with 3 rows down them. And maybe each bed is 150 feet to 200 feet long at the most of carrots here. But I've been able to grow out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of carrot roots and produce seed that is top quality because it's got enough genetic variation here for those outcrossers to be able to share pollen and share genetic information adequately in yet a still fairly small amount of land. And I want to show you a picture of what the carrots that come out of this kind of work looks like. We've been saving this line, this is a Nantes corylus variety, saving this line for about 10 years now. And the quality of the carrots that we get is fantastic. That's a picture of my wife holding up some of the carrots from our seed line. And you can see that they all have that distinct Nantes corylus blunt tip. They've got great shape, great color, nice strong tops where the greens come out the very center of the crown. Those are all part of our selection criteria. And because we grow, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 or so carrots to start with, we can select down to 500 and be very choosy, but still allow a nice number of crops to do from. And we've been saving outcrossers this way, whether it's onions or carrots or radishes, for many years, and I think doing a really good job of it on what's still a fairly small piece of land. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the selection and roguing that we do here. And this is an example of working with, again, on fairly small scale, but still with adequate numbers, working on another outcrosser. This one is radishes. And so here you see a single bed of radishes that's got 4 rows down it. And maybe that bed is 150 feet long or so at the most. But you can plant radishes pretty close together, as you know, just a few inches apart. So there's a lot of radishes tied up in that bed. And when they get to maturity, we go through and we actually pull all the plants and do our selection. Selection is not difficult. It's very common sense. And just to prove it, this picture is me doing the selection with a few Belgian woofers that were volunteering at our farm and who knew nothing about agriculture when they arrived there. But I was able to give them basic instructions on how to do the selection with me, and we walked them through the process. So first we picked all of the radishes and laid them out so that we can then look at them all in the field. This is a variety called Pink Beauty that we've been growing for a number of years. Give you a bit of a closer look at them growing in the field there. So I would go through and tell the woofers and any employees that we're working with as we're doing the selection what our selection criteria is. We want round, we're looking for round roots. We're looking for that obviously very skinny rat tail to the thing. We don't want any long rat tails. We don't want oval shaped roots. We want tops and greens that are coming right out the center of the crown. So we sort of have 4 or 5, and we want nice pink colored skin. We don't want red. So we have maybe 4 or 5 different selection criteria, and we just go through and we select out all the ones that we want to plant, and then we eventually put them back in the ground. But because we've got hundreds and hundreds of roots here, we can cull out or rogue out the ones that don't fit that very well, and we're left with really beautiful roots to replant in the ground. And we're able to take an outcrosser, and even after years of maintaining this line, it looks great. This is what it looks like when it goes to market production later on, because we're doing that kind of roguing and selection. And it's not difficult to do. At the very simplest, you can put it down to you're pulling out the uglies. And I've always liked that because that simplifies the process. But it is nice to have a few other more positive selection criteria you're looking for. Everybody wants to have one of these who's a seed saver. It's a seed saving and planting guide. This is one that I've used for years that came out of the old Abundant Life Seed Foundation catalog. But you'll find many of these kinds of things in seed saving books all over the place. I like this one because on one single page, it gives you all the information you need to make your selection, do your planning and selection stuff when it comes to most of the common vegetable seed crops. So you can refer back to this one if you want by going online to the Bauta website later on and looking at it. And that's the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was really, really good. I'm going to, reiterate that we're going to be recording these, and we will have some of these resources up on the website afterwards. We're going to skip right to the next presenter. Our next speaker is Dan Brisebois. Dan is the co-author of Crop Planning for Organic Vegetable Growers and is the past president of Canadian Organic Growers, a USC Canada board member, and on the Eastern Canadian Organic Seed Growers Network Steering Committee. Dan is one of the 5 members of Tourne-Sol Cooperative Farm in Le Cedar, Quebec. Tourne-Sol produces certified organic vegetables, flowers, seeds, seedlings, and herbal teas on 12 acres rented from an organic grain farm. Tourne-Sol's products are distributed through a 250-share CSA, farmers market, and online seed catalog. You can reach Dan at daniel@fermatournesol.qc.ca and follow his blog at goingtoseed.wordpress.com. Both of those links will be up at the end of Dan's presentation as well.
I'm Dan Brisebois, and I'll be talking more about what you do with the seed once you've produced it. So let me just, okay. So the four things I'll go through is what are the intended use of your seed crop? What crops are good for the climate that you're growing in? Analyzing the profitability of the crops that you're growing, and then how to sell your seeds. So when you choose to grow a seed crop, there's different types of use you might have, and depending on what you're growing the seed crop for might affect how rigorous you are about all the stuff that Patrick just talked about, especially isolation distances and population size. So on one side of the spectrum is growing seed for personal use. So this would be seed that you're saving to plant in your home garden or on your farm, and that you don't really have any intention of sharing with anybody or selling it. And in that case, you could have stuff grown much closer than recommended isolation distances. And even if you see a little bit of crossing, it's not the end of the world because you're the only person who lives with it. And a lot of crops, even if they're crossed up a bit, are still fantastic for eating. And sometimes crossing a crop up can add a little bit of diversity to it, and it looks nice. On the other end of the spectrum would be selling seed would be commercial seed. So this is selling seed either as a seed company in packets to gardeners or farmers, or to other seed companies who then resell it. Now in this case, you have to stand behind the seed that you're selling. And it's really important that it's true to type. So that means respecting isolation distances very well. And if you have smaller isolation distances than the recommendations, you should have a strategy in place that lets this possible. In some cases, if you're growing salad greens like arugula and you're growing them closer together, or to other arugula crops of a different variety, if you're able to grow the seed out in the fall, you can see whether it's crossed up and what the germination's like. So it makes it easier to have shorter isolation distances because you can check them out later on. Whereas if you're growing something like squash, you won't only know the next year what the crop is like, so you won't be able to do a grow out in the same season. And in between those two uses would be called community use. So this is seed that you plan on saving and then trading at seeds fairs or trading with your neighbors. And this doesn't have to be as rigorous as commercial seed, but you should put a little bit more work than if it's just seed for yourself. And what's important in this case is that you share your practices with your neighbors so they know what to expect when they're growing out your seed. So for the rest of my slides, I'm going to talk more about seed for commercial use. So, where I guess I'll be moving into seed for commercial use. So this is, I'll just show a couple slides of what commercial use might look like. So this is a field of Mizuna on our farm, and we have a lot of plants growing to seed here, and this will produce something like 10 or 15 pounds of seed. So this is not for our own personal use, though we do use a lot of it. These are banana legs tomatoes that we're growing out for seed, and you can see there's a dozen or so buckets, and we're squishing them with boots. And then afterwards we ferment our tomatoes in garbage pails. So this is a little bit larger than, for your backyard. If you're doing this just for yourself, you might be doing this in a mayonnaise jar. So now almost any crop can be grown anywhere in the world. However, some crops do a lot better in certain areas than other crops do. And when you're choosing crops that you're going to grow a large area of or a number of plants, you should specialize in crops that do better for yourself. And climate has a really big impact on that. And depending where you are in Canada, I mean, we all have a certain extent of winter, but some of us have a lot of snow and really cold temperatures, and others can overwinter crops in their fields. So climate can have certain impacts like that, but there's also the amount of wetness and heat has a big impact. So here's one chart that's from the Organic Seed Alliance, their handbook, Climate Considerations for Seed Crops, and they divide crops into 3 groups. Cool season. So these would be crops that probably like, to have the summer in the mid-20s Celsius. Warm season might like, closer to 30, and then hot season prefers even higher than that. And then dry-seeded and wet-seeded crops. Dry-seeded crops are crops that dry down in the field, like beans or brassica greens. And then when you harvest them and clean them, you don't want to add any water to that because you want to avoid any disease. Whereas wet-seeded crops would be crops that are grown in a fleshy fruit, like tomatoes, peppers, squash. And these are crops that usually water is extracted. So right off the bat, where we are, we're outside of Montreal. We have quite hot summers most years, kind of in the high 20s, low 30s, and it's very humid. So cool season crops, stuff like spinach, beets, chard, we don't have a huge success level with those. Cilantro, we've had some good crops and some not so good crops. Whereas stuff like the hot season stuff, beans, cucumbers, squash, we can grow those really, really well. They just perform better in our area. You can usually have more vigorous plants and better yield. And then another aspect is how the crop fares in a humid condition. So this first chart, crops that are in too cool an area, if they're in a hot season, it's possible the pollen dries up before there can be a good pollination. So you might have lower yields than you would normally, and you might have lower germination rates. Stuff that's hot season crops, like beans, in cool season areas, they might be much more susceptible to fungal and bacterial diseases. So the other way to think about it is also how the crop is protected. So some seeds, like Umbelliferae family, which includes carrots, coriander, dill, the seeds are just sitting there on the top of the plants. They're not protected by anything, so they're called naked seeds. And these are seeds that are exposed to all the humidity and all the weather. So if you have a lot of rain, or even if you just have really humid conditions because you're close to big bodies of water, this can have an impact on seed-borne disease. It can also influence seed germinating earlier, like while it's still on the plant. And in some cases, in really humid conditions, you might have the flowers rotting before they even set seed. So naked seeds don't do well in a humid climate. Protected seeds are seeds that, in the dry-seeded category, they have little pods of some sort, such as brassicas. There's a little typo there. Brassicas or beans or peas have little pods that protect the seeds inside from the humidity. Or corn has the husk that protects the kernels inside. So these crops can tolerate better humid conditions. And then wet seeds have that fleshy fruit around them that protect it also. So wet seeds especially, because stuff like tomato crops, squash, love heat and have that protected fruit, do really well in our climate, kind of in the northeast or in eastern Canada around Montreal, where we have a lot of hot and wet summers. So you should try to grow whatever you want to grow seed from, especially stuff that you like to grow the vegetable of. But you should recognize that certain crops are likely to do better just because of their biological considerations. And so the crops that we specialize in are a lot because of climate. So we grow a lot of brassica greens. They have those pods which protect them. We grow a lot of tomatoes and peppers, and we grow a lot of cucurbits, melons, and squash. We also grow a fair amount of beans and peas. So all these crops can tolerate the heat and are protected against the humidity. We do grow other seed crops too, but just not in the same volume as we grow these crops. and we don't rely on them year after year. We don't rely on them every year because we realize that we do get crop failures more often with those other crops, and the excuse me, the germination might not always be top notch. So another thing to think about when you're choosing seed crops, specifically for sale, is what crops are profitable for you. And if you're doing a true profit analysis, you would look at the income you can generate from a crop and then subtract all the expenses, the different input costs, portion of your overhead, and also assign a certain amount for the labor that goes into it. And the difference between your income and your revenue would be your income and your expenses would be your profit. Now that's a really great tool to do, but it can take a lot of time. So we use a couple of benchmarks, and we look especially at how much space a crop takes and how much time a crop takes to harvest. So today I will skip over the time part, and I'll put a little bit more emphasis on the space because it's fairly easy to explain. So, and I will take a note to warn that I tend to use weights, metric units like grams and kilograms when I'm talking about weights, but I usually think about distances in terms of feet. And I find the metric weights are easier to calculate with, but imperial distances are easier to think about. So just stand warned. Now, when you're talking about how much space a crop takes, you're often thinking about the dollars that a certain acreage would generate, and this averages out to a certain amount of dollars per bed foot in the field. Now, a bed foot is if you take a full field, a full bed, and you take a slice that's 1 foot wide by the full, 1 foot long by the full width of the bed. That's a bed foot. So if you can generate about $250 off of a bed foot, that's about $20,000 an acre. If you can generate $5 a bed foot, that's about $40,000 an acre. And for the smaller the acreage you have, the more important that your crops generate more per acre. If you only have 1 acre, you probably want to be doing closer to the $40,000 than the $10,000 per acre. Whereas if you had 10 acres or 20 acres or even 100, you can be lower on this chart and still be profitable. So to calculate the profit in space, you essentially take the yield of the crop multiplied by the price of the crop, and that gives you a certain dollar per bed foot. So if we were talking about lettuce heads, the vegetable lettuce, if you could harvest 900 heads of lettuce from a bed that was 300 foot long, and you sold those heads for $250 a piece, that would give you about $750 a bed foot. So that's a crop that comes out to about $60,000 an acre, and that's assuming that you can sell all of these, that you have a market for them. So this would be a crop that's fairly profitable for the space that it's taking, and it's easy to think about that in terms of vegetables, but we use the same analysis for seeds. So the chart we were looking at. So for seeds, we'll look at the grams that a certain bed foot yields, and we'll multiply by the price. So if we had a Brassica green like Mizuna or arugula, and if we were able to harvest 3,000 grams from a 75 bed foot area, that would give us about 40 grams a bed foot. And if we're selling that bulk, so we're selling it either to a farmer or we're selling it to another seed company that might be reselling it in packets, and we can get $40 for 400 grams, that's about 10 cents a gram. So this crop is worth about $4 a bed foot, which is just shy of the $40,000 an acre kind of area, which is probably profitable for most small to medium growers. Now, in contrast, if you were to put that same seed that you harvested in packets, and you charged $3 a packet, and you had 4 grams in each packet, would give you about 75 cents a gram. So suddenly that same seed crop is worth about $30 a bed foot. So you can see that selling stuff in packets, if you have the market for it, can be quite profitable. And so when we look at a seed crop that we're growing out, we're always thinking, is this a crop that's, I guess we're thinking about three things. One is it a crop for our own personal use? And in that case, we're not really putting it through a profitability analysis. And if it's for sale, is it a crop that we plan on selling out bulk to other seed companies? Or something that we plan on selling bulk to other farmers? Or do we only intend on selling as packets? So in these Brassica greens, we would happily sell it either bulk or packet because it's profitable in either case. I mean, we love the $30 a bed foot, but even at $4 a bed foot, that pays for its way. So here's a chart with a number of different seed crops, and some of them have the seed yields that we've achieved on our farm. We don't really grow any. We haven't had success in umbel, so there's no weight there. And I would say that these yields are specific to our growing situation. So they're there for reference purpose, but they're not absolute. So if we look at this, alliums, the onion family, these can be profitable, but in our climate, in a humid climate, there's a lot of disease potential. So we wouldn't grow them as bulk crop because we don't want to spread disease to other growers. So they'd probably do better in a drier area. In that case, they'd be very profitable. Beans and peas, for the yield it takes, you need to have a fairly high price to sell them bulk if you want to get them at $40,000 an acre. So in this case, we'd be talking about $12 to $20 a pound, which is possibly more than a lot of seed companies or farmers would be willing to pay. Beets and brassicas, lettuce, solanaceae, all those crops can be both quite profitable as a bulk crop or as a packet crop, though climate makes a big impact, especially for the beets and chard and the lettuce. So for us, some years we can get the quality we're looking for and the quantity we need to sell bulk, and some years we can't. And then cucurbits are another funny crop. Well, not funny crop. They're also a crop that we need to get a good enough price to make it profitable. However, some of the really common varieties are easily available for low prices. So those aren't, if you can't get a good price for it, it's not worth it on a bulk level. Now, there are a couple of references that I've found that do list a lot of yields. One is by Brian Connolly in The Wisdom of Plant Heritage, Organic Seed Production and Saving, and the other is Patrick Steiner, who's on this webinar's Small Scale Organic Seed Production. And both of those references have a number of different yields. Again, these are specific to the growers that are being referenced, but they're a good starting point for this kind of analysis. Now, to think back in terms of looking at the profit in space, when people look at this, it's very easy to wonder, why don't you just grow stuff for packet and just sell it that way? And it does seem like an easy way to make money, but there's a big difference between growing seed for bulk sales to seed companies versus growing seed that you're going to be repackaging and just selling as packets. First off, you only get that $30 a bed foot if you've sold all the seed. So in the example that I was showing, we were harvesting about 3,000 grams, and at 4 grams a packet, that's 750 packets. That's not an easy amount of Brassica seed to sell if you don't have a good marketing system, you don't have a good web store, a good seed catalog. And there's a lot of time that goes into all the packaging and all the marketing. So a lot of that profit from just the growing gets eaten up in the management, the administration, and the marketing. Whereas a bulk seed crop, you might make less money overall, but once it's cleaned, you can package it and send it off to your client, and then you don't have the headaches of dealing with the rest of it anymore. So I think it's a great ambition to want to be a seed company that does packets, but I think it fits into a lot more farm plans of just growing bulk seed to sell to other seed companies. So the last part I'll just address is selling your seed. So if you direct market your seed, that would be in packets. And an easy way in Canada to just jump into that is through Seedy Saturdays and Seedy Sundays. And that's probably the first place to do, is to, if you have a few varieties, put them up into envelopes with nice labels or nice handwritten information on it. And then you can easily sell that at a seed event. The next step would be to invest in a web store, which can be fairly easy, and go up from there. Now, if you want to grow seed on contract, there's a couple things to think about. I guess first off is who your clients are, and that would be other seed companies. And the easiest way to deal with that, or to meet them, would be to call them up and talk to them. Or if you're at a Seedy Saturday or Seedy Sunday, choose a quiet moment, if there are any, and approach them, or at a farming conference and approach them and just tell them that you're a grower who's thinking about seed, and ask whether they'd be interested in you growing seed for them. And I mean, a lot of seed companies are looking for growers, so they'll probably be very excited about that. And then they'll ask you how much experience you have, and the more experience, the better. Though in just about any case, unless you have a reputation as a good seed grower with other seed companies, most seed companies won't take a risk on you right away. They might have you grow one or two things out and buy a smaller amount from you if it's successful. When we started off about 10 years ago, we approached a couple seed companies, and they gave us a couple seed packets of tomato seed, and they asked us to grow it out. And in the fall, they committed to buying, half a cup or a cup's worth of seed at so and so rate. And then we fulfilled that, and we did that a couple of years, and added a few more varieties. And then we were already growing other Brassica seed at that point, and we offered it to them. And because they had a good experience with us in the tomato seed, they started to expand their purchases from us. So at this point, there's a few seed companies that buy a fair amount of bulk seed from us because we developed a reputation over the last 10 years. And so it's important to build that reputation. And it's a reputation that goes both ways. In part, the seed company needs to have confidence in you, but you also want to trust the seed company. And you want to know that they'll take what you purchased, and that they'll also pay for what they've purchased from you. So over time, this is a relationship you can build. And the last thing also before you sell your seed is you have to build a relationship with your own seed. And as I was explaining earlier, if you're growing a Brassica green like arugula or mizuna that you harvest in midsummer and they can grow out in the fall, and you can see it has great germination and that it's true to type, it's much easier to sell that seed than something like squash that you'll only see the following year. So it might take you 4 or 5 years as a squash seed grower to start to get confidence that your growing systems work, because it takes longer for you to see the results of your work. So on that note, I would say reflect well who you're selling your seed to. And I would say thanks for listening through so far. And I guess I would hand this over to Michelle.
Awesome. Actually, I'll jump in here, Dan. This is Steph. Thanks very much for that. We've got one speaker left. Some questions have been coming in, so I've been making a note of those, and we can address them in the question period. So keep those coming if you want, because I am paying attention to them. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Michelle Smith. Michelle has been market gardening and farming in Cape Breton for 30 years. She grows a wide variety of open pollinated heirloom seeds, and over the years has built up a store of practical and technical knowledge. She grows and saves seed stock of grains, dry beans, potatoes, squashes, and tomatoes as part of her rotation, devoting 5 acres of her 40-acre farm to horticultural crops and small grains. She serves on the board of Seeds of Diversity Canada as secretary and has represented alternative producers with the Federation of Agriculture. She's been a staunch advocate in many arenas for farmer-driven agricultural policies and farmer-centered rural development. Michelle is also the seed extension specialist for the Buddha Family Initiative. Welcome, Michelle. Your presentation is loading up there now.
All right. Let's wait till and I have to apologize. I had literally a computer crash this weekend. The clock fell on my computer.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of clip art. I hope everybody forgives me. Is this doing what it's supposed to, Stephanie?
Yep. So you can...
I'm not seeing anything on my screen is all.
Oh, you're not seeing that.
I'm just seeing Adobe Presenter.
Okay. So it's maybe taking an extra second to load.
Okay.
For you, I think probably you have a bit of a dodgier Wi-Fi connection.
I'm sure I do.
So it's probably just taking a little bit longer.
All right. Whoa. Oh, there we go. Very nice. Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry, everybody. I'm not, this is why I'm a farmer. They don't usually let me near the computer too often. All right. So in sourcing seed, there's a lot of choices come on. Oh, there we go. So where do you get the seed that you want to start working with? How do you source seed? And there's a lot of choices from small regional seed companies to larger national catalogs or even companies in other countries, not to mention Seedy Saturdays, exchanges, and gifts from friends and neighbors. So when deciding which seeds are best for you and what you want to work with, it helps to think about the following considerations. Should you use organic or ecologically grown seed or not? Now, some varieties do better in organic growing systems than others. They may tolerate more weed pressure, or their roots might manage their own nutrient uptake better than varieties used in high-input systems. However, this is more related to the genetics of the variety than to the organic production of the seed itself. Organic seed sources are more likely to be working on varieties suited to organic production, but this still might not translate into adaptation to your area or growing conditions, especially in marginal regions, and Cape Breton certainly qualifies as that. Unless you have sort of philosophical or certification concerns, you need to also think about the availability and range of varieties you want to work with. Most certification will allow for non-organic seed if you demonstrate it's a variety that you need. In any case, once you grow it on a certified farm for a year, it is considered acceptable. That's if you need to, if you need or want to consider about certified organic seed. Another consideration is, do you know and trust the source? If the company or person you're getting seed from is not one you know well, it might be wise not to risk too much at first. The seed may be dead, poor germination, it may not be true to type. You know, with the best effort in the world, there's mistakes that can happen with contamination from other cultivars. If your farm plan hinges on quality seed stock, I would suggest buying only a little at first. I once wasted 6 weeks of prime greenhouse time and space on dead onion seed before I realized what was wrong, and I had to scramble to replace it, and it set back my whole farm plan that year. On the other hand, some of the most wonderful seeds I grow were given to me by older gardeners from Cape Breton's large immigrant community, and I'm really proud and pleased that they trust me enough to take care of their seeds. Sometimes surprises can be fun, but at other times they are trouble. You decide where you draw the line. The next is, are you interested in locally tested seeds, or are you willing to experiment with other varieties that may be cross-adapted? Even if the seed did not originate in your area, some cultivars exhibit surprising adaptability even away from their native home. I grow black turtle and yellow oleracea beans in Cape Breton. They're far from their warmer dryland climates, but the thin walls of the pods mean they dry down easily when pulled and piled on trestles in my barn. Jacob's cattle, which is a popular maritime variety, does not do so well for me under this system. And the wide gene expression of open-pollinated varieties is something that can work to your advantage. So it's good to try local, but it's also good to experiment a little bit. The next is, what scale are you planning on? Are you planning on a small home or farm-based trial, or a large-scale grow-out with commercial production in mind? So cost can be a consideration here. If the seed you want comes in a $3 packet of 50 beans, you're going to need 2 or 3 packets to make sure you get your minimum population after roguing and selecting. And you add another couple of packets in case you've got to replant after a cold, wet spring, or the sheep stage a breakout, you know, disasters. If your source is new to you, it may be wise to just do a trial grow out the first year to assess the quality of the seed and if it's a variety you want to work with. If it pans out, you can do a proper grow out the following year. This is a longer-term strategy, but the trials can all be grown together to save garden space, and it saves time working with seed that turns out to be unsuitable for what you want. I call this area the Mongol garden, and the trials grow alongside the orphan plants left from the spring transplant sales. So sorting out those 4 things, keeping them clear in your mind, is going to help you decide, on the approach that's best for you and where you want to get the seed. So then you can start to choose the seeds, which is the fun part. But it means learning how to read a seed catalog. You can successfully save seed from any variety that is not a hybrid. Okay? Hybrids are the result of using 2 very different varieties as parents to produce seed that will hopefully exhibit the best traits of both. And you've heard of hybrid vigor. Breeders also use very narrow parent lines to ensure they're selecting genetics for exactly the traits they want. The trouble is, every time you want more seed, you have to make the cross again, because the seed from that hybrid will not breed true in the next generation. It usually doesn't even look like either of the parents. Tomatoes, for example, often revert to wild types. The beefsteak tomato from the supermarket will look like a little currant that's the size of your thumbnail. And that squash growing out of the compost heap, that might be hard and bitter like its wild cousins, too. So the seeds you want are called open pollinated. Okay, so that means that a variety population is grown so that it's kept to reproducing within itself, and it will breed true to type. Look at that. Okay, whoops. And this, I also want to reiterate what Patrick and Dan were saying. It's why it's important to ensure you're working with at least the minimum population recommended. Vigor and productivity of OP varieties are developed and assessed over the whole population. Too small a population results in inbreeding depression, and a really good sized grow out means you can select more rigorously to maintain the plant's genetics and even improve it. So the minimums are different. I see Patrick and I have the same slide. That is such a good one. So open pollinated are not always labeled as such in the gardening catalog, but hybrids almost always are. They're labeled F1, which means the first generation cross, if you remember high school biology, but sometimes you have to read the description carefully. Like in the one on the left there, it's pretty obvious, it's F1. On the one on the right, you have to go all the way down to the middle of the paragraph. So some of the better gardening catalogs that cater to market gardeners or more technical growers, they're better at it, but others you have to read a bit carefully. Okay, so integrating seed production into your current farm plan is not hard, but you need to take some time at the beginning because looking ahead can avoid disappointment and disaster. You need to evaluate your growing area to make sure you have room for the size of the grow out and the isolation distances you need, as well as the space. I wanted to talk about the wide row spacing I use. I didn't have a slide for this, but in Cape Breton we've got such a humid fall. We plant our beans 36 inches apart between rows because we have to have really, really good air circulation. And if you can't sacrifice that kind of space, then you have to think about that. Although we found with the really humid summer we had last year that the wide row spacing meant that all our bean crops, even the ones we weren't selling for, or saving for seed, were a lot healthier. So, for us, it was a win-win. And I even sometimes map it out. This is not what my farm looks like. It's a stunt farm, and a map that you can really picture it all in your mind. Significant barriers like trees, large buildings, and fence rows. The rule of thumb is that it can reduce isolation distances by up to a half, but only up to a half. And a healthy population of wild pollinators, like the many species of small solitary bees, it's clearly a good thing, but it's going to increase the distance needed between varieties. I know that bean plants aren't supposed to cross, but we've got such a lot of wild pollinator reserves here in Cape Breton, we have to keep 150 feet between our bean grow-outs. So small plots might not exhibit the effect, but with larger grow-outs, you're simply going to see more of it. Like, it's just math. If you have 20 bean plants and a 5% crossing risk, which is not acceptable for commercial seed production, you maybe will get one rogue plant, and you might not even see that. That's just probability theory. But if you grow 100 to 500 plants, you're going to definitely see more of the off types. Okay, so keep the little so-and-sos far enough apart. I have tall stakes pounded in every 50 feet or 15 meters along my field edges, and I paint the tops really bright so I can just eyeball the distances quickly without measuring. Now, if you've got a dual-purpose bean like Black Valentine or Thibodeau du Comte Beauce, which is the one here, you might want to sell or eat the fresh ones as well as the dried ones. But if you pick the fresh ones first, the next ones may not ripen in time for quality seed stock. I tried to be smart one year, and I let the first beans ripen, thinking I'd eat the next ones, but I found out that once bush beans set fruit, they figure they've done their job and they start working to rule. You can't have it both ways, as it turns out, but a way around it is to plant them in a block, which will reduce the isolation distance, and you can eat fresh from the plants on the perimeter, and you can save seed from the middle. Okay, so the other thing with beans that Dan was talking about, profitability, we have 3 income streams with beans. We have seed stock, then we have table stock, and then we have chicken stock. So if, you save the best, you eat the next, and or sell the next, I suppose, and then you and the chickens get to eat the next best. You have to soak them if you feed them to the chickens, but it's a good way to reduce your feed bill. So you can cheat a bit. Row covers, as Patrick mentioned, for tomatoes. I've done that at certain times, but you have to use larger framed cages for peppers because they don't like pressure on their growing points. I have used row covers on bean plants, but in Cape Breton, the higher humidity underneath of row covers is a real problem for them, as it encourages molds and leaf blights. So I only do it if I've screwed up, and the only other choice is tearing up the planting. So obviously, if the plant needs insects to be pollinated, row covers are not an option unless you're doing your carrots in the high tunnels like Patrick. So make sure what your neighbors are growing as well. And I'm going to say the same thing again. Queen Anne's lace is the same as carrots, and here it's just ubiquitous. You're gonna just get it everywhere. So I haven't figured out a way to grow carrots in Cape Breton yet. I'm hoping Patrick's experiments will give me some direction there. So do your homework again about the species you're working on. If you didn't know until now that a pumpkin and a zucchini are exactly the same thing, give your crash course on the Latin names of plants. The pepos, the maximas, and the mochatas are different species, and they won't cross, but they look a lot alike. So I only grow one variety from each species a year. You can take blossoms and hand pollinate them, and probably everyone should do it once just so that they kind of get it. But with the minimum population of at least 20 plants, I do not have the time. And of course, you have to talk to your gardening neighbors. So the more cultivars you're working on, oh, see, and there's even a cucumber that's really a melon, right? So it can really fool you. Do your Latin math. Too bad they don't teach Latin in schools anymore. So the more cultivars you're working with, the more complicated the logistics. So ramp it up slowly while you find the limits of your space and your patience for record keeping. I maintain 40 to 50 tomato varieties. These are not all my varieties, but Cocopelli had such a beautiful picture. So I grow them out on a 5-year rotation, so only 10 per year need particular attention. Handled carefully, my seed stays more than acceptably viable for that 5 years. I label each container with the grow-out year and the batch number. If I ferment more than one batch of a variety, they don't get lumped in the same container. I separate them, and I'm just so paranoid about mistakes and mixing things up. So I'm a little obsessive about record keeping. So all 50 of my varieties are grown for sale as transplants in the spring, which also serves as a regular germination check and is recorded. And all the varieties are unique. I mostly got them from CD Saturdays, and they're adapted to my difficult Cape Breton growing season and the many needs and tastes of my customers. I tell them I'm going to suit the tomato to their personality. Soft salad or sandwiches, what kind of gardening do they do? Large scale, small scale, in a window pot, something like that. So it's very popular. So that's the main income from my tomatoes. And it comes in the spring, which is when income is low on a farm, so that's very good. In a good growing year, I can't compete with the productivity of hybrids, and no one makes money when tomatoes are 50 cents a pound. But good growing years for tomatoes are at most 3 out of 5 in Cape Breton, and in the off years, I'm the only one with ripe tomatoes. So customer acceptance also has to be brought along if you're not in an urban center with a kind of foodie culture. People unfamiliar with the wide range of shapes, colors, and tastes of heritage crops might need to be convinced. It wasn't that long ago that my customers refused red leaf lettuce because they thought it looked like seaweed. And if they wanted yellow potatoes, they put butter on them. Thank you very much. Now my customers in the staunchly Scottish Gaelic community demand those Lebanese zucchini things. Ah, Kusa, the great leveler. I'm very proud of them. We've come a long way from cabbages and turnips. Purple potatoes, however, are still a ways off. So whatever you do and on whatever scale you do it, same thing as the other two said, be careful to follow the recommendations for growing good seed. Sometimes accidents happen, and they can be either new discoveries or they can be mistakes, plain and simple. Until you know the difference, don't perpetuate them or let them out into the public sphere. You don't want to be that grower with the scruffy seed at the spring swap, or worse, the one who jeopardizes another farmer's livelihood with dead or off-type seed. Respect the seed, respect the hard work and dedication of the long line of farmers and seed savers who placed it in your hands. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Michelle. So that concludes our presentations. Thanks so much, Dan, Patrick, and Michelle, for sharing that with us. We're about 20 past the hour now. We originally advertised this webinar to go to half past the hour, which leaves us with 10 minutes for sure for questions. And if our presenters are okay with it, maybe I'll suggest that we go a little bit longer. For those of you who can't stay past half past, feel free to throw your question into the chat, and if you need to leave, then we'll put it in the queue, and you could always access it as part of the recording after the fact. So we can start now. A few questions have been thrown into the queue so far. I'll start with a couple that came up during Patrick's presentation. The first one, Patrick, is from Carl Sutton, who is asking, what is your carrot yield approximately per steckling?
I'm embarrassed to say that I'm really bad at keeping those kind of records, and I don't really know what my carrot yield per steckling would be. What I can say is that, you know, in the length of season that we have, we're able to harvest seeds from the primary umbel, the secondary, and the tertiary umbels. Nothing more than that, just because we run out of season length and the seeds don't dry down. Even at that point, when we're doing our seed cleaning through screening and through wind, I end up blowing away some of the smaller seeds, and that's always part of the final lot improvement. That kind of post-harvest handling of seeds is an important side of seed production, because it allows me to get a more what's the word I'm looking for, but a more relatively even-sized seed lot in the end. And that creates better seed that I sell to my customers because they germinate more evenly and so forth. But I wish I could tell them I don't have a yield for my carrot seed per steckling.
Okay. The second question that came up for you, Patrick, is from Sarah Enslin, and she says, when you select at the typical market size, does that reduce the storability or vigor of the second-year plants for biennials?
I don't think it would reduce either, assuming you've got decent storage and they make it through. Once you plant them in the ground, those carrots then put out a lot of side shoots, a lot of small root hairs. And then, of course, they start putting up to 2, 3, 4, 5 foot high greens that are all part of the vigor of the plant and then feeding the plant to produce seed and drive seed production. So I don't think, you know, keeping a carrot that's whatever, only an inch and a half diameter or something, it reduces its viability. One of the things I will say is we do harvest and bag for storage, you know, however much we do each year. And not all of that always makes it through storage. So I might go through a certain time in the winter and then again in the spring, and I'll toss out some of the ones that have softened up or starting to rot. And the nice thing about that is that unintentionally, I guess naturally, there's a certain amount of selection in my seed line happening for storageability there. After many years of doing that, theoretically, I'd actually have a selection for better storing carrots.
Thank you. Dan, we have a question for you. Your first question comes from Colin, and he wrote, what is the expectation when selling seed bulk to another company? How clean does the seed need to be? How much tolerance of lighter seed if it is going to be recleaned by the company? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and maybe Patrick can also speak to that because I know he buys in from people. I think it has to be. Well, generally the seed is the company pays for the final cleaned weight of the seed. They're not paying for the uncleaned weight. So the cleaner you get it, the better idea of how much it weighs anyway. If there's a lot of work that the seed company has to do, they might charge the grower for that. I would say that the people who grow for us, they get the seed to a point where there's no sticks or pods in there, but there might be a little bit of dust, a little bit of chaff if it's like similar size to the seed, and then we will put it through a last cleaning, and we clean it somewhat aggressively. We don't want to have light seeds in there that aren't going to have good vigor or that might not germinate well, after a year or two. Sometimes these lots we'll be selling them for 2 or 3 years, so it's important that the seed lot is cleaned well. Yeah, Patrick, do you have anything to say on that point?
Yeah, I could add because like you said, I have an experience of having a number of growers that supply seed for us, and I basically ask them to clean it to the best of their ability, and then they ship it to me, and usually that's fairly clean. But in many cases, I'm doing a final cleaning, kind of like what Dan points out, to get rid of some small dust or a little bit of chaff here or there, or getting rid of some of the lighter seed. And I only pay them for the final weight of the clean seed that I've received after I've re-cleaned it. And what I try and do is give feedback to growers who've provided me with seed as to what I thought about the quality of their seed cleaning. I praise them if it's great seed, and I gently give some suggestions for ways certain lots could have been made cleaner or so forth. And it becomes a relationship with the grower. And what I've noticed is that the growers that I work with year after year all improve their seed cleaning over time. So it's helpful to the seed company to get the cleanest seed possible, but it's not required. I have enough stuff to clean it as well, and I pay for the final lot.
Okay, awesome. Michelle, we have a question for you that's come in with regards to sourcing from Rebecca Ivanoff. She says, I learned about utility patents yesterday. Can you discuss how to know you can grow out the seeds that you buy from larger companies?
Generally speaking, they will be clearly marked as plant variety protected, PVP. Otherwise than that, you're free to go. As I say, the PVP is the main sort of tool that they use to regulate that. And even then, if it was only for your home use, it's more if it goes off your farm or you try and propagate it commercially or something. That's the only time that you're really going to run into trouble for that. But PVP is what you look for, and the best catalogs. Well, I can't even think of any significant catalog that wouldn't have that when that was an issue with a certain variety.
Okay.
I would just add that there is a database online, and I can't remember the email address, but if you look up for PVP through Google, there is a database of all the varieties that have patents issued for them for the PVP patents and when it expires. And I think they're issued for something like, 17 or 20 years. And once that's expired, they can be, they're in the public domain. So sugar snap peas, for example, or other varieties that might have been PVP at one point that are no longer.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I was just sort of, trying to decide, how you told really quickly. It's not like, and it's some of the smaller seed companies too. Like who's the guy that we met at OSA who developed Indigo Rose, that new tomato? That's PVP.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Another question has come in for Patrick. Jenna wrote, Patrick, I have a question, I've wondered about seed saving for a long time. For varieties that you grow on a small scale, do you ever need to swap seeds with another grower of that variety to freshen up the genetics? For example, every 8 or 10 years or something? Or is that potentially detrimental at the risk that the seeds are not as pure?
My answer would be that if you're swapping seeds with somebody, you just want to be confident in their seed production skills. You probably ask them about, their isolation distances and their selection and that kind of thing. And if you're happy with what the grower's skills and experience are, swapping seeds is a great idea. You might not want to necessarily put your two lots together right away before you've maybe grown out some of their seed to see what it's like. But on our own scale, I never grow anything in such a small quantity that I feel the need to refresh my genetics by swapping seed with others at this point. But I don't think I think if you are growing on a really small scale, that kind of pooling of seed is probably a helpful and a good idea if you're growing on a really small scale, say some of the outcrossers and things like that.
An interesting and very broad one came in that maybe I'd invite all three of you. You probably all have a lot to say about it, but I'd invite you maybe to briefly weigh in on the value or the use of heirlooms versus other kinds of seeds, and why there might be such a growing movement, such an interest in growing heirlooms.
I'd like to jump in on this one because I did mention gene expression briefly in my talk. I'll tell a little story about it. I have this tomato variety that I grew on a coastal farm north of here. That was this sort of miserable little variety that was productive enough, but didn't do too much up there. And I moved farms a few years ago and grew it on the second farm, and it was 3 feet tall and covered with fruit. Open pollinated because you're working with a pollination just has this broader range of adaptations of genes that kind of click on and click off in response to environmental conditions. And that adaptability, you might lose in productivity and a few things like that, but that adaptability in extreme climate conditions or areas that are marginal for horticulture, they really make a lot of sense. And these days when we're all talking about climate change, we all could be in a marginal area depending on the summer. So for me, it's adaptation that the OPs have over everything else.
Okay. Dan or Patrick, do you guys want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I guess the question is specifically about heirlooms, and the term heirloom can mean different things to different people. Generally, it refers to seed that's over 50 years old, I think around 1950 or so, when from before that period when the first commercial hybrids were released. And heirlooms can be varieties that a community has preserved for a long time. It can be varieties that a family has preserved through a long time. And it can also be an old commercial standard that was dropped by the commercial trade, but individuals have held. So heirlooms fit all those things. And there's definitely, they have fantastic stories, which is one of the great things about them. It makes them easy to sell. And there's a lot of notions about them being more biodiverse. But heirlooms aren't inherently better than other kinds of seed. If they haven't been well maintained, if their population size is too small, they may not have they may not perform the same way, and especially if the isolation distances haven't been respected, you might have something that's very crossed up. So the quality just might not be there. Also, heirlooms are adapted to a place usually, and if you grow it far outside of its home, it might not do well where you are. So heirlooms, just for being heirlooms, aren't great. What we're looking for is good OP varieties that can perform well under our conditions. And if they happen to be heirlooms, that's fantastic. And we really want to grow good seed now that respects all the stuff that Patrick was talking about, because the good OP varieties we have now are the heirlooms for tomorrow. And that's what we want to have, is leave a good legacy behind us.
I think what both of you have said sums it up a lot, and I guess I'll say 2 points. One of the reasons that so many of us like heirlooms on top of all those things that have been said is that they're in the public domain. And so they're seeds that we can freely save, and even if we want to, we're building a business around it, freely sell. And so that's really important. A lot of us who do this, don't really appreciate the sort of private profiteering off seeds that's happened in the 20th century. And so working with heirlooms and bringing them back into both the trading network and then a small scale commercial network has been really important work for us. The other side to, what's the big deal with heirlooms? It's kind of like what Dan just said. The varieties that we're working and breeding with today are going to be the heirlooms tomorrow. And let's say 15 years ago in the seed growing and seed saving community, everybody was concerned about saving heirloom seeds and keeping that biodiversity available and out there. Thanks to the work of Seeds of Diversity and the whole Seedy Saturday movement and so forth that's really flourished over the last decade and a half, I could safely say that we've done a lot of that seed saving and saving of heirloom varieties. And now seed savers are sort of turning their attention to developing new varieties or regionally adapted versions of older varieties and kind of renaming them. And that's sort of some of the most exciting work that's going on with seed saving these days. And even to the extent of taking, as we just heard at the last Organic Seed Alliance conference, of taking hybrid varieties and breeding new OP cultivars out of them that can then be used in the public domain and by organic growers, and the seeds saved and shared and even sold. So lots to say great for heirlooms, and lots to say great for developing the new heirlooms of tomorrow with more sort of our current plant saving or plant breeding and seed saving practices.
I think what we're saying is that cultural traditions are a living thing and subject to change.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed seeing that question come in and your answers to it. Another one has come in regarding isolation distances. You all spoke a little bit to that, but I might direct this to Patrick just to start off with, because I think it's most related to maybe your fundamentals talk. Christine Swarn has written, we have 35 beehives, so pollination is great, but cross-pollination is more likely. What veggies would be most safe for seed production? What adaptation can I make to isolation distances?
Yeah, you often get people ask, how can I, quote, cheat on isolation distances? Because they want to be able to save a broad variety of seeds, maybe of the same genus and species within a fairly small geographic area on their farm. So we get this question all the time, and that's why I often suggest starting with the self-pollinators, especially tomatoes, lettuce, peas, and beans. They're the least likely to outcross. So that's where I would focus your efforts first. But if you want to start working with crossers and you do still have a lot of beans, I either say you just choose one variety of each genus and species to save seed from, and you limit yourself to that. Then you don't have a problem. And what you can do is consider growing varieties out over successive years. So say you want to save 4 different squashes and they're all of the same genus and species. Well, you can grow each of those 1 year after the other and save the seed without having a problem. And the seed, because the seed longevity of those squashes is generally good for 4 or 5 years or longer if you've got good seed storage, you don't need to worry about not having viable seed for a while. So that's another way to approach it. And then there's always the, creating isolation with physical barriers, or doing hand pollinating, as Michelle pointed out with squashes. You can do hand pollinating, and you can do that with some other crops as well.
Okay.
Anybody
Michelle
else want
or
to add
Dan,
to that?
want to weigh in on that?
I also am a big fan of, hijacking other gardening enthusiasts to help you with grow outs. If you can only grow one from each species of squash every year, find a few friends and then you can grow lots more and share it all together. Cooperate if you can.
I would say that I totally agree with Patrick about the easy crops to grow, all the selfers. I would say that in my experience, recommended isolation distances in most books are much higher than they need to be for our situation. Like with brassicas, I find I can get away with a couple thousand feet, maybe even 1,000 feet, whereas in a lot of books it might be closer to a mile what they're asking for, and I mean, as I was explaining earlier, I can see whether they've crossed up or not in the fall. And what's different, a lot of recommended resources are set for production areas, and they have big fields full of pollen going everywhere. So we're not in that same context. And it's with time you can see what you can get away with. But I do know a lot of seed growers who have good seed that's true to type with much less isolation distances. But you have to, don't just assume it. You have to witness it and experience it.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dan. It's really sort of site specific. I mean, I never would have believed that I had to keep so much distance between my dry beans, but I really do, and I don't care what the books say.
Okay, so dipping back into the kind of list of questions, these are tapering off now, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to address all of them. What should I pick? Okay, Annette Nilsson has written in to say, how sure of type can I be if I grow peppers and tomatoes mixed in the same greenhouse? I don't know who wants to take a stab at that one. Maybe Michelle?
I've done it. It depends on, if your greenhouse is open, if you keep the sides rolled up in the summer and so that the pollinators can run in and out, or fly in and out. There's a guy I know, however, in Calgary who keeps a closed greenhouse because there's no way to get ripe tomatoes in Calgary without keeping his greenhouse closed. So he has no pollinators in there, but he does his own buzz pollination with the help of an electric toothbrush. So I think it's all about technique. There's a lot of creative ideas out there. But if you've got your sides open and you've got a lot of bees flying around and all those wonderful flowers in one place, they're gonna be a little promiscuous there.
I would highlight that peppers especially, you'll see a lot more crossing than you would with tomatoes. And
Yeah.
even between different species, I've seen some crossing, much to my dismay.
Yep. And Brassica rapa and the Napas, there's actually a 1% cross, even though they're supposedly, and that's just accidental crossing, even though they're not even the same species. There's some things are more plastic than others. So.
Great. We have a question from Joyce. How do you protect your outcrossers from pollination from other farms that may be near you? Maybe Patrick, would you like to address that?
Yeah, well, essentially, other than asking your farming neighbor if they're growing something that's the same genus and species as you to not grow it, there's no way to really protect it other than some of the mechanisms we've talked about, creating isolation barriers, either by maybe planting things that will grow quickly or putting up a physical structure. But realistically, you're probably a little bit at the mercy of your neighbors. Like we have neighbors at our farm who our immediate next door neighbors grow a lot of squash for their own consumption and for market. And so I can't really grow squash on my farm unless I start to hand pollinate. We started experimenting with that last year, and we'll be growing out our seeds this year to just see how true to type we've actually been able to do. But it's just one of the realities. If you have a neighbor who's close within those recommended isolation distances, you're not likely to be able to get away on outcrossers with growing the same thing. But like Daniel and Michelle have pointed out, all these isolation distances and recommendations need to be taken with a certain grain of salt. And you save seed of something on your farm that you believe may have crossed with a neighbor, grow it out the next year and see if it did actually cross. You may find that just that little hedgerow or whatever it is that's between your farm and theirs, or the highway or the road traffic or something, is enough of a barrier that you're not really getting cross-contamination. So there's only one way to find out, and that's to grow out your own seed.
Okay.
Did that?
Great.
Yeah.
So we're almost at the end of the list, and I realized that I missed a really early question that I'll put out to you guys. It's from Nigel, and He says, could someone speak about planting in blocks as opposed to planting in rows when it comes to seed crops?
It depends. I think I mentioned planting in blocks. Sometimes I do that with my beans if I need to have them a little closer together. And, and I've sort of got my head around, what a good way to do that is. Some things, however, if they're wind pollinated, do need to be planted in blocks anyway, like corn and stuff like that. So, but block planting is a good technique if it works with your garden space, and because especially with inbreeders, you can harvest a seed crop from the middle instead of the sides, and I've had quite a lot of success with that. I can reduce my isolation to 50 feet with the beans if I'm quite careful about it. The big block, though.
What I would add, I would just add to that, yeah. I think being able to plant in blocks is often the ideal for seed saving because you're getting the best, when the flowers are pollinating and the bees and insects are out there, you're getting the best crossing between plants of genetic information. So you're adding to your genetic vigor among your plants and so forth, rather than planting in just a few long straight rows. So it's the ideal to aim for. And, you have to temper that with the reality of, say you're on a farm and you're trying to grow all these different blocks all over the place. Maybe your tractor cultivation or you're getting in and out of those areas is more difficult to do in blocks often than it is in long rows, which is why many farmers and even seed growers end up reverting to the long rows just because of the simplicity of managing those crops. But growing in, if you can do it, growing in blocks, I think, is the ideal.
I agree.
Yeah, I would say that one of the ways I've gotten around having to avoiding rows is if I have, let's say, 3 rows side by side, I'll try to put things that are similar in spacing in the same rows, but plant them in blocks. So maybe if it's a 300-foot bed and I had three 300-foot beds side by side, the first 60 feet might be like a Brassica gentiana mustard, and then the next 60 feet might be arugula, and then the next 60 feet might be some lettuces, and the next 60 feet might be something else. So the actual beds are being broken down into blocks just to promote that pollination.
I tend to do my large cultivation with the tractor, and then I do all the cultivation in between, through the season with the rototiller, which is way more time consuming, but it makes sense for my block planting.
Great. Thanks all very much for that. I think that's the end of the questions, and we're just about at the end of our 30 minutes that we'd set aside for questions. So I might cut us off there. I've mentioned a couple of times that this is being recorded. We'll post it. The website is up on your screens now. Be a little bit patient with us because I'm not exactly sure how to do that yet, but we will get the content up. I'd also, once again, invite you to email me with feedback about this webinar, what you thought about the content and the format. My email address is seed@acornorganic.org. My name is Stephanie, so I would look forward to hearing what you have to say. We had an amazing participation in this webinar. We had 100 people for the presentations, and we still have about 60 people now who stuck around for questions. So I want to really enthusiastically and sincerely thank the 3 of you for making some time to do this. We've had some amazing feedback on our chat feed. So Dan, Michelle, and Patrick, thank you so much. And if you'd like to leave us with some parting words, feel free.
Stephanie, I was thinking that if people had further questions, if you wanted, I would be more than open to, if they send them to you, then you could forward them to me. I would do the best I could with them, and maybe the other 2 would be open to that as well. But anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, okay. I think that sounds great.
Yeah, I'm also open to that. And the 2 things I would say, one, I noticed there was a question about seed storage, and it's important to store your seeds dry and at constant temperature, not too hot, but constant temperature is more important than cold. So I'd say that. And then otherwise, I would just say start small if you're new to seed saving and try stuff out and don't be afraid of mistakes. Just just pay attention and do your best.
Great.
I had a lot of fun. Thanks a lot. I even learned some things listening to Dan and Michelle, and that was really great. And I also wanted to just jump in on that seed storage question. A really simple way to know exactly how good your storage is to purchase for $20 at most hardware stores a digital hygrometer, and that will tell you both the relative humidity and temperature in your room or your storage space. And there's a formula to figure out if you've got good storage. Temperature plus relative humidity should be less than 100. And that's the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, I should say. So temperature plus relative humidity should be less than 100. And if you can achieve that, then you've got great storage.
Great, and that's actually good, Dan, that you brought that question up because, as I've mentioned, this is the first of 4 webinars we're going to be having in this series, and one of them is we're going to have the opportunity to dive into seed storage and later season issues with other speakers later on in the season. So thank you guys for remembering to address that. Okay, well, I'm going to call it. Thank you so much for participating, Dan, Michelle, and Patrick, and everybody who's still on the line. Hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime soon.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Dan and Patrick. Bye-bye.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.